Today's topic: questions to ask of a high performer. In other words, when you come across someone who is a high performer at what they do, even if you are already one yourself, here are the questions that you should ask them. And this is especially important, especially those of you who are already high performers. When you come across a fellow high performer, you should ask them these questions. And if you are not a high performer and you come across a high performer, you should ask them these questions. So when I say high performer, I just mean someone who, in your eyes, in your estimation, they are performing at a uh, high level relative to others who may be in the same lane or doing a similar thing. They're up there. They're in the upper echelon of performers at their particular thing. So you don't have to really know their space that well to tell when someone's overperforming versus everybody else. It's kind of like in basketball, for example. You don't have to really understand the game of basketball to watch a game and tell who the best player or players are. It's pretty obvious. You just watch. If you watch something like, what's another space? Any space where you see multiple people engaging and they're doing a similar thing, you can tell who the best is because you can look at how other people are responding to that person. You can also just look at the way that person is doing what they're doing. Does it seem like they're doing whatever the positive result is and they're doing it more often than everybody else? You often can tell without even knowing much about the particular space that these people are doing their thing in. Like I can go to a boxing gym and tell who's the best boxer, as opposed to I can tell who the best boxer is even if I didn't know much about boxing. Or I can watch a sport that I don't know anything about, like kickboxing or something, and know who the best one is. Again, first of all, by looking at what they're doing, understanding what the goal is, and secondly, by looking at the way everyone else, the people who do know the game, how they're responding to the person who is allegedly the best. Just the context clues of response between people. So anytime you come across a high performer, there I just told you how to identify them. I find that even when someone knows and acknowledges that they're in the presence of these people, someone who's really good at what they do, people fail to ask the right questions of the high performer, or even ask questions at all of that high performer to find out how they got to the position that they're in or how they maintain the position that they're in. I remember there was this TV show. I can't remember what the name of the show was. It was a what do they call those shows? And the words just escaping me. But it's one of, I forget even how you describe the show, but it was one of those shows that was on probably about 2009, 2010. And in one of the episodes, the man, and it was a show with two people, man and woman, husband and wife, and they had kids. And they went to a Los Angeles Lakers basketball game, and they got Kobe Bryant in one of the episodes of the show. And these people got it was kind of like a little meet and greet kind of with Kobe before the game, and Kobe's standing in the tunnel with his uniform on, like loosening up, getting ready to play in the game. And the guy sees Kobe and he kind of freezes up a little bit because he doesn't know what to say. And then he says to Kobe, "Do you like basketball?" And Kobe looked at him like, "Really? Like, really? That's the question that you came up with of all the things that you could ask me?" See, that's the kind of things people say when they run into a high performer instead of saying the things that I'm going to share here today. So make sure next time you come across a high performer, whether you get 10 seconds with them or you're with them for 10 days, I'm going to help you out. And you can use these questions every time you come across a high performing individual. They are universal, regardless of industry, regardless of the background of who the high performer is or where they come from. And you will probably be surprised to find that high performers are rarely asked the questions that I'm going to give you here today. So all you have to do is take note of them and start using these next time you come across a high performing individual. Ready? Good. Point number one. Topic again today is questions to ask of a high performer next time you meet one. Number one, what are you doing that everybody else is not doing? Next time you meet a high performing individual, ask them this question: what are you doing that everybody else is not doing? This is a really good question to ask someone who is a high performing individual. Why? Because nobody ever asked the question, and because of the answer that you're going to get. You should always ask this of anyone who seems to be outperforming their peers, especially when their peers, and this is usually the case, seem to have access to the same information, they're working in the same spaces, and they're using the same tools. So how is this person at such a higher level than everyone else when they all have access to the same stuff? So we'll use Kobe Bryant here since I brought his name up. Kobe is not alive anymore, but assuming that he was, or when he was, if you had met Kobe Bryant, you could ask him this, because every player who plays basketball in the NBA, they all have access to similar information. Any of them can go hire a trainer. All of them knows what a trainer is. All of them knows kind of what it looks and feels like to work on their game in practice. And they're usually all in the same spaces. Everyone has access to a gym and a fitness facility and a track and whatever other tools that Kobe could buy, they could buy. It's not like he's buying something that other players couldn't afford. All right, so he has access to the same stuff they all had access to. So what makes him different from everyone else? Obviously, it's not some resource that other people don't have access to. It's something that he's doing that they're not doing. So you should ask him, what are you doing that everybody else isn't doing? And he would give you an answer. And again, you'd be surprised that many high performers are never asked this question. And the reason that a lot of people don't ask high performers this question is because I think subconsciously a lot of people just don't want to know the answer. A lot of people don't really want to know what is that high performer doing that everybody else is not doing, because now when you know it, now you're somewhat on some level responsible for it. So what if you met Kobe Bryant and he said, well, one thing I do that everybody else doesn't do is that I tend to practice more than they practice. So I practice with the team, of course, but I also practice on my own game probably 3 times as much as all of my teammates do. And now that you know that, if you want to be a high performer at what you do, now you're kind of responsible for that information that you need to practice 3 times as much as your teammates if you want to be as good as Kobe Bryant. And if you don't do it, then you would feel guilty because he gave you the information and you didn't use it. This is, I think, subconsciously the reason many people don't ask this question of high performers, even though you should ask it of every high performer you come across. All right. And again, everyone has access to the same stuff. So what makes a person a high performer is that their resources, intelligence, and access is generally equal to everybody else in their space. Yet they're somehow outperforming everyone else in a significant way. And you're like, how is that even possible? So you want to use this question as often as possible when you come across someone who appears to be producing results that few others are producing, because there's something in their approach that is different from everybody else's approach. And the interesting thing is that whatever they are doing differently is not, again, some deep government secret that no one else has access to. It's often something that everyone else could do. It's just other people aren't doing it. And general rule about human beings is that they're lazy. Also that they don't think and they don't read. But those 3 points, I've been sharing those for years with people. People don't think, they don't read, and they're lazy. So if you want to separate yourself from most people, all you got to do is the opposite of that. Most people just don't want to put in the effort. In the sports and fitness world, for example, often the thing is that the highest performing players in sports are simply more disciplined in their training and in their preparation. It's not that there are players who don't train at all. Most players have to do some level of training. It's just that the highest performers are just more disciplined in their training. I mean, they do it more often, they're more consistent, they're more reliable, and they have more of a process, a system for how they train, as opposed to other players who kind of just do it whenever the feeling hits them. And this applies in many other industries as well. I've read about a guy he built a really big and successful financial advising company. And one of the things that was noted about him is that he would show up a little bit earlier than most of his peers. He would stay later than most of his peers, and he would spend time reading and going over news and notes about the industry, reading books about the industry. And he just developed more knowledge through his discipline of getting the information of how to best operate his business, or not even just the information about it, but he got all the information, and from that he probably picked and chose what are the best practices that I can use from everything that I'm taking in. Professionals, everybody, prepare more than they perform. Professionals prepare more than they perform. When I played basketball and I had my content online was, for the first 10 years that I was online, most of my content was basketball based, and I was talking to basketball players. And players would often ask me about how often they should practice and things like that. And I told them the same thing I'll tell you now, is that I had what I call the 10-to-1 rule, in that for every 1 minute that I spent playing in a basketball game, I spent 10 minutes practicing basketball. Or for every 1 game of basketball that I play in. When I say game, I don't mean just a professional official game, not just a recreational league game. I mean a game of 1-on-1, a game of 3-on-3, a 5-on-5 pickup game at LA Fitness. For every 1 game that I played in, I had 10 practice sessions. And why is that? That is because I want my game to be as sharp as possible. Your game gets sharp not through playing in games, but through practicing. You get experience as to how to use what you practice when you play in games, but the practice was the most important part. And I guarantee you, any of you who are high performers listen to this, you can probably co-sign what I just said. Your number might be bigger than 10-to-1, but it has to be at least 10-to-1. I found that athletes, especially in my journey as an athlete, because when I started out, most of the athletes around me, basketball players, are better than me. They didn't have nearly the practice. They didn't have the practice ratio that I had. In other words, they were better than me, even though they didn't practice hardly at all. They would practice maybe 2-1, their ratio, 2 practices for 1 game. Mine was 10-1, yet they were still better than me for a couple of years until I eventually caught up to them and eventually surpassed them. By the time I was past most of them, they were already out of the game because their lack of preparation, practice, was not enough to keep them ascending skill wise as they got older and moved into higher levels of play where there was more natural selection, meaning the better players were the ones who got to ascend. And if you weren't continually making yourself better, you weren't one of the better players. So the best professionals, folks, they prepare more than their peers prepare. And then they go out and they perform. So the preparation, let's always remember this, that is the hallmark of the professional, their preparation, not their performance, the preparation. Point number 2. Today's topic, once again, is questions you should ask anytime you run into a high performer. Number 2, what are you not doing that everyone else is doing? This is another very good question. And these questions, actually, I came up with these. I could have told you this in the intro. I was doing some sales training for a company, these people who run an insurance sales company. They have an insurance sales business, but then they have a bigger company where they help other people who are in insurance sales. And they were telling me a little bit about their business. And it got me thinking about these very questions. That's where this actually came from. And so after you ask the first question, what are you doing that everybody else is not doing? The second question, this is one that you probably, if you ask this of a high performer, they'll probably tell you that no one has ever asked them this question. But it's a question that they will have answers to. And they'll probably want to talk about it a lot because nobody ever asked. And it's a very important question if you know to ask it. What are you doing? What are you not doing, rather, that everybody else is doing? What do you abstain from that everyone else seems to put resources into? This is a counterintuitive question that, again, most high performers have never been asked, but I guarantee you they have answers. And you can use this one to break the ice. If you can ask this one first, actually, if you don't ask it second. Usually in any line of work, now I'm going to explain to you why this matters. In any line of work, there are certain quote unquote best practices that everybody follows. Now, some of these best practices, however, are actually not really, they're not even good, let alone are they best practices. And the high level performer has figured out which best practices, i.e. accepted dogma that everyone in the industry follows, which ones where can they break the rules and flip around this practice and turn it into something useful, meaning i.e. just not doing it and maybe doing something completely different, or just completely discarding this best practice, not doing it at all, while their peers are using a lot of their resources and doing this thing that doesn't even produce the result that they think it does. So, for example, I'll share with you a few things I've heard from people who work in the sales space who have used this to get ahead of their fellow salespeople. Before I even get to that, Dan Kennedy, who's a guy I've quoted and mentioned him here multiple times. He's a marketing guy who's in his 70s nowadays. He's basically retired from the business, and his stuff was not really online. He did a lot of his heyday of marketing. His stuff was, he did offline marketing, but many of the principles and the strategies and the things that he taught to his clients back in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, the principles are still universal and they still apply. And you can still find his stuff. He's written a ton of books. You can find his books online. Again, his name is Dan Kennedy. A lot of his books are he calls it the no BS. This whole thing is called no BS. So he's basically a get straight to the point, cut to the chase type of guy. That's his communication style. So if that happens to be the type that you like to hear or like to read, I suggest you go look up some Dan Kennedy books. And one of the things that Dan Kennedy talks about is breaking the rules. Is one of his newsletters that his company still writes to this day, and I subscribe to, is a paid newsletter, and I mean a physical newsletter. You get in the physical mailbox. One of the things that he talked about in the latest issue that I read was all about breaking the rules. That if you want to stand out in business, you can't just follow the same rules that everybody else is following, because then you're in a kind of a smartness contest against everybody else, and y'all all doing the same thing. Nobody's really going to stand out. What you want to do is figure out which rules you can break, and you can go against the grain and create an opportunity for yourself. So to these ideas, so salesperson, there was one salesperson who said instead of making all their calls from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., which is what all of his peers were doing and all his competitors as well were doing in sales, he decided that he would make calls from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then again from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. And the reason he did this during the off-peak hours is because the people who he was trying to reach, i.e. the decision makers, they usually either showed up to work early or they stayed at work late. Why? Because they're one of the leaders. They usually have to do more work than the administrators and the secretaries and the rank and file people. And he found that he got more and better results getting in touch with the decision makers by working only 4 hours during off peak times, than working 8 hours during on peak times. So that's an example of going against the best practices. And a decision maker, again, that's the person they're trying to reach anyway. And between 9 and 5, who do you reach when you try to call somebody? Usually you reach the gatekeeper. You reach the administrator, the secretary, the person who's trying to block you. But if you call when the secretary is not at work, well, it goes straight to the main person. So another salesperson, they decided, I heard another salesperson say this, that instead of just calling leads at random, that they would only focus on the high ticket prospects, people who are looking to spend an outsized amount of money. So instead of just calling on all the prospects who you're going to try to sell them $1,000 product, instead, this salesperson decided, I'm only going to call on people who I can sell them a $50,000 product. And if we just do the math on that, how many $1,000 customers do you need to get to make $50,000? Well, you need 50. Well, how many $50,000 customers do you need to make $50,000? You only need one. And this again is going against the grain of what most people do. Now, on the surface, what I just explained sounds pretty simple. All right, why would you not do that? Why not just only call the $50,000 people and you only got to make one sale instead of making $50,000 sales? Well, why don't most people do it? The reason most people don't do it is because we have been programmed to believe that we need to be putting out effort to feel like we're actually working. And if you're not putting out effort, then you must be being too lazy. And technically, there is some truth to that. I understand the direction of that. What you would just need to do is find ways to spend more time looking for and finding $50,000 customers, not just calling $1,000 customers just so you can say that you're busy and you're doing something. So a lot more closed business and a lot more commission happens when you're selling a $50,000 product as opposed to a $1,000 product, even though you're making fewer overall sales and it probably takes less overall effort. So anybody can do these things. It just requires a slight bit of outside the box thinking combined with the courage to actually do something different than what everyone around you is doing, which is really the main thing that stops many people from doing this, is that they just don't have the courage to do something that nobody else is doing because they'll feel like they're like the odd man or odd woman out, especially if it hasn't quite yet worked. Then everybody is scrutinizing you. But when it starts working, then all of a sudden people see and things change. And despite that, people still won't go do it because, again, most other people don't have the courage. No matter how much they see other people doing it, they don't think they can do it. Point number 3, today's topic, once again, is questions you should ask of a high performer next time you're talking to one. Number 3, how could someone get started on a path towards being at your level? So someone's doing a similar thing to you, Mr. or Mrs. High Performer, and they wanted to get to your level. How did they get started? What should they do first? As with the other two, there's another great question to ask of a high performer, and often one that they don't get asked as often as you might think. So you would ask them, how can somebody get started on your path? They'll usually respond by telling you to do some things that anyone could do, that everyone has access to, and that everybody knows about, but many people are either too lazy or too arrogant to actually do. And I just told you, the effort and just the willingness to show up and do the work, which we call discipline over here, is a differentiating factor simply because most people have no discipline. Not that people don't know what to be disciplined at, they just don't do it. That's the opportunity right there. The opportunity in life, everybody, is always in the opposites. We covered this in episode 1025. The opportunity is in looking at what everybody else is doing or not doing and getting on the other side of that table and flipping it around. That's your opportunity. Everybody has access to a lot of stuff that they don't use. I go to the gym, beautiful gym that I go to. I know they have a lot of members. I don't see too many people in there on a consistent basis. People just don't show up consistently. I see some people for a couple of weeks and I don't see them for months. Somebody tells me I'm going to be here this consistently and then they don't show up. All right, so this is just how people are. So if you can just be consistent, you have an opportunity, a huge opportunity. And be consistent and stay consistent as well. But so spending more time studying your industry, what's actually happening in your world so you know what's going on, that gives you an advantage. Showing up earlier, staying later, that is an advantage. Practicing and preparing for your craft more than others in your space. Again, I just told you the 10-to-1 ratio that I had as an athlete that I still use these days as an entrepreneur. Giving up time-wasting activities that everyone else in your space looks at as a basic necessity of doing the job. You don't have to do time-wasting activities just because everybody else doesn't. So these best practices exist in every single industry. Regardless of what you do for a living, they are there. You need to find out what the best practices are. Some of them you should probably follow. So if you're a construction worker, then one of the best practices is you need to wear a hard hat when you're on a construction site, just in case something falls on your head so it doesn't give you a concussion or kill you. That's the best practice that you should probably keep following. but there are other best practices that you probably should not follow. Your job is to figure out what the best practices are, then decide which ones you're going to go against the grain with so you can find the opportunity. And it may take a little bit of tinkering, or you can just go find one of the best and ask them, what is it? They already know. Guarantee you they already know the answer. So your job is to find them. And again, they can often be found very easily in books or online for free, the best practices, that is. And then the choice is, where am I going to zag where everybody else is zigging? All right, where am I going to go to opposite? Understand that executing on these, whatever you come up with, things that you're going to go against the grain with, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do everything yourself, depending on what line of work you're in. This is one of those practices that most average performers seem to have stuck in their minds. Is the very reason why they remain average, because a lot of people think they have to do everything on their own. I guarantee if you talk to some high performers in certain industries and you ask them, what are some of the things that everybody else does that you don't do? One of the things they might say is, everybody else does everything on their own. They do all their own work. They do 100% of the work themselves in their business. I'm not doing 100% of work myself. I do half of it, and the other half I have automated and outsourced and other things, and people take care of it. So that frees me up to do more high leverage stuff. High level performers, folks, always use other people and other things to get stuff done. A high level performer is not necessarily a person who's just putting in more effort than everybody else put together, because only one person can do that, and out efforting everybody else is not really a formula for success. What a high level performer actually does is they get more things done, not because they're doing it. They just figure out the formulas and the processes, and they put the structures in place so that more things can get done, not necessarily by them. And it's not necessarily that they're out efforting you. It's just that they're putting more effort into the things that matter, as opposed to where you're putting your effort into things that cause you to sweat but don't actually produce a result. Let's recap today's class, which is questions you should ask anytime you come across a high performer. I find that even when someone knows and acknowledges that they are talking to a high performer, they don't ask the right questions. They ask the silly question that this guy in this TV show asked. He saw Kobe Bryant and said, "Do you like basketball?" Because he couldn't think of anything else to say. I'm telling you what to say next time you run into a high performer. Number one, what are you doing that everybody else in your space is not doing? Very simple question that very few people ask, because I think a lot of people don't really want to know. Number two, what are you not doing that everybody else is doing? It's a counterintuitive question, but it's one that you will find if you use it. Most high performers have never been asked this question, but you should ask the question and you should take note of the answer. Number three, how can somebody get started on a path to being at your level? Not getting started just doing what you do, but being at your level. How can someone get started to getting there? Because obviously there's a lot of people, high performer, who do the same thing you do, but they're not at your level. How can I get started to get to your level? Not just to do shit, but to get to your level. How do I do that? And get the answer. All that said, folks, workonyourgameuniversity.com. You want to be a high level performer? You want to know how to ask the right questions? You want to ask better quality questions of yourself, which is going to change your mindset, which will change your skill set and action set and change your outcomes? Go to workonyourgameuniversity.com, and that's where we get started. Work on your game. Dre, all